series, we've been talking about questions that cause us to wonder. Specifically, how do God and science relate to each other? And how do we still live with a sense of wonder and curiosity as we make sense and find answers about the world around us? As we wrap up this series, I wanted to start with some building blocks. I've got Jenga here, and I kind of want to move it, but I don't want to knock it over yet. Oh, ninja. All right. What does what we have to talk about tonight have to do with blocks? Someone asked. Come on.
Molecules.
No, not molecules. I just want someone to go, what does tonight have to do with blocks? So I'm glad you asked.
Hey,
Thanks, Isaiah. Thanks.
Gravity.
Look, when you build a tower like this, some parts matter a little bit more than others, don't they? For example, I can take one of these top blocks and I can pick it up and move it, and I don't even have to worry about this tower falling over, right? It doesn't, it matters to the tower, but it doesn't matter a whole lot to its structural integrity. Now, I could come down here to maybe one of these midsections. I think I'll grab this one. Now, I have to think a little bit before I grab that one. But you see, the middle ones are a little bit more important to the tower. If you're playing Jenga, a lot of times you start with the middle ones, right? You're like, ooh, if I can start there, maybe I can get the thing to topple a little bit. Okay, so the middle ones, again, they're more important, but they're not the most important. What does matter the most to this entire tower are the bottom blocks. I don't know about you, but when I play Jenga, I play mean, and I like to start with the bottom ones. But the bottom ones, because you can only take two of them before the thing starts to get tipsy, right? When you build a tower, you gotta make sure your foundation is good. When you're building a tower, when you're building something, anything, you gotta make sure what's on the bottom is strong enough to hold up the rest. Think of it like this. Think of it, I like MCU stuff, Marvel, all that stuff. If you watched, say, the latest Spider-Man, imagine you had watched, No Way Home, but you had never seen any other Marvel movie. You'd be a little bit confused, right? You'd be like, wait, where's the rest of those guys? Where's those Avengers? Where's that Iron Man dude? What's going on here? You'd be a little bit confused. What's going on here? In the same way, when it comes to our understanding of the world around us, and when it comes to our faith, we want to make sure we build on something solid. We want to make sure the most important parts are where they belong. So that when there are parts that we encounter in life, science or otherwise, that maybe come at us, confuse us, make us question a Bible story we heard, doesn't make a lot of sense, we can be sure that we have a foundation on this tower that's going to hold. A foundation that makes sense, a foundation that we can build our faith on reliably. The question then that we ask ourselves as we come to the end of this series is, what foundation are you building your faith on? What's holding your faith up? I think for a lot of us, we could probably say three things. You might come up with more, but I've got three here. We might build our faith on Bible stories. Our faith matters because the Bible tells us it should. The Bible's a really good authority. I think it's the best authority, the highest authority. And the Bible tells me that my faith should matter. We believe Jesus because of what the Bible says about him. We read stories like David and Goliath, Noah and the ark, Paul and his missionary travels, and we're amazed and inspired and challenged. For some of us, we've grown up in the church and we've heard these stories for as long as we can remember, so we just assume, I should believe them, let's go with it. So maybe the Bible stories make up the bottom layer of our tower. Another thing that might make up our foundation is other people's expectations. Maybe for some of us, if we're being honest, we admit that we're here tonight or in this church at all because someone else wants us to be. Maybe it's your mom or dad, maybe a sibling, maybe a boyfriend or girlfriend, someone who says, hey, I think church is important, you should probably go. And you might be still figuring out your faith. So you show up, but you show up for someone else. And you kind of think, it's probably not worth creating conflict over, so I just go, and I make the best of it. Another thing that might build the foundation to your faith is tragedy, or even trauma in your life. Maybe for you, your faith sprung out of a time where you were going through something difficult, and you discovered God, and you needed him, and it helped you through a difficult time. But now that you've gotten through it, maybe you think more about it, you wonder if maybe that faith has done what it was supposed to do. You're wondering, does it still play a part anymore? Does it still make a lot of sense to me? Maybe you feel like you've outgrown it. Here's the problem. What happens when those layers just don't hold up anymore? What happens when science bumps up against the stories we read in the Bible? Or maybe the faith that's been passed down to us from others? What happens when that bottom layer just doesn't intersect with real life and we're trying to figure out how does this Bible thing or faith thing apply to my reality? If the building blocks of your faith are stories from the Bible, maybe facts that other people, maybe including your family, faith things that they've passed down, what if it's what they believe, what happens when a classmate, a college professor, a teacher, a future boss, someone, a friend, challenges what you believe? If someone brings solid evidence to say that the stories that you've grown up believing may not have happened the way that you recall them, do you hit a crisis of faith? Does your entire tower just crumble? Because if someone can disprove that foundation, there it goes, right? If someone can rip apart the foundation and you wrote it, the rest of it falls. But here's the good news. I don't think it has to be this way. For many, it is. As a youth pastor, I care a lot about students, and depending on which research study you look at, research tells us that after your senior year of high school, by the time you finish your freshman year of college, 50 to 80% of you will walk away from the faith because you don't have a strong enough foundation. And I don't say that tonight to guilt trip you, but to ask you, what are you building your faith on? What's the foundation? Where does your hope lie? Science isn't the enemy, even though sometimes it does ask questions that it's really hard for our faith to answer. And that's okay. We talked about that in week 1. We can build our faith on a foundation that has stood for 2,000 years and has always been what Christianity was supposed to be founded on from the very beginning. So what is our faith to be built on? What's that foundation? To find out, we're going back about 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, a man named Jesus, the God-man, fully God, fully man, lived and died by crucifixion on a cross. He was killed because he claimed to be God, and he said and did things that made the religious leaders pretty nervous. They weren't so sure if God actually acted that way. They had an idea of what God was like and what it was like to worship him. And then Jesus, he shows up, and he lifts up people that were looked down on. He included people that were excluded. He loved and he valued people that were typically passed by. That wasn't how the world worked back then. And the leaders who were used to having the authority, the power, whatever you want to call it, the final say, their word was pretty much law. They didn't like what Jesus was about. They felt threatened. They felt attacked. And so they devised a plan to have Jesus stopped, to have him arrested, beaten, and killed. The crazy thing about this Jesus guy is that he didn't resist it. Think about that. I mean, he knew what was going to happen. And yet he still chose to go to Jerusalem, where the plot was going to be played out to have him arrested, falsely accused, and he took it all up. He didn't defend his case. He didn't hurl insults back. He was beaten, and he was killed. He died, and in the process, forgave them, said, "Forgive them, Father, they don't even know what they're doing." As the Son of God, Jesus could have made it stop, but he didn't. Have you ever thought why? Jesus allowed himself to be put to death because as God's son, he was the perfect representation of what God was like. He was the perfect sacrifice. And as the God-man living on this earth, he was willing to die when he had done nothing wrong and forgiving the people not only who put him there, but forgiving all of us should we choose to believe and put our faith and trust in him. He showed us what God was like: love, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and redemption. So Jesus dies on a cross, was placed in a tomb. You're like, Pastor Rich, don't we talk about this at Easter? Yes. If you feel like you've heard it a bunch, don't tune it out. This is so important. Jesus died. Now, when you think about that, that's not really surprising. Every religious leader, political leader, every person dies. But Jesus' story is different because he doesn't stay dead. And it's really one of the most unique things that sets Christianity apart from other world religions, is we have a God who came back from the dead. So Matthew, one of Jesus' close friends, recounts the story of the resurrection. He picks up in Matthew chapter 28, and there are some women who are going to the tomb where Jesus was laid, probably to give him a proper burial because He was rushed to the tomb because of Sabbath law and regulation. Matthew tells us what happens next. In verse 2, suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it. His face shone like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow, and the guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angel spoke to the women. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come and see where his body was laying." Try to imagine what it must have been like to be one of the women there at the tomb. Angels showing up. I mean, big, manly soldiers have passed out afraid. These women are showing up, and the angel says, first, don't be afraid, because they're kind of terrifying. And also, hey, that thing that Jesus said would happen, happened. Come and see. He didn't stay dead. What was true about what would happen to every person, yes, it happened to Jesus, but he didn't stay that way. He was resurrected. Now, this is where things get tricky, because we're reading a Bible story, so our brain goes, well, that's faith. But someone coming back from the dead is science. It's biology. So now we have faith and science intersecting in the most important moment in history. You don't have to be a scientific genius to know things like this do not happen. Unless you're into zombie movies, but that's different, right? Jesus didn't come back as a zombie. He came back full and whole. And this event 2,000 years ago, the Christian faith has been built on this foundation of the resurrection. It's the most important building block. So if we're going to rebuild our tower, we need something better. I went all in on this one, right? So now we can start building a foundation of faith that will hold, because this thing is rock solid. You're like, it's not rock solid. I can tip that over, right? It's rock solid. You get the idea. It's bigger. It's better. 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, give or take a few, the Apostle Paul, was writing a letter to the church in the city of Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians 15:14, Paul says that if Christ had not been raised, then our preaching is useless and your faith is useless. In other words, without the resurrection, everything we believe, Paul says, is pointless. Going from death to life is what gives us the point of the what and the why. Why would God do that? Why did Jesus not save himself? Because he loved you and I so much that he went to the cross to be the perfect sacrifice to rescue us from our sin back into relationship with God. Anyone else excited about that just a little bit? Right, that's good news. Paul didn't say, if the earth wasn't made in 6 days, your preaching is useless and your faith is useless. He didn't say if Jonah wasn't swallowed by an actual fish, or if Noah didn't build an actual ark, or if Adam and Eve weren't real historical figures talking to an actual snake, then your faith is useless. He didn't say those things because those things aren't the building blocks of our faith. Because whether science wants to say the earth was made in 6 literal days, or old earth 10,000 or so years, or billions of years, it doesn't affect our faith too much, because it's not the point. What happened on the cross and the days following to the resurrection and everything that event represents, that's what matters most. Those other things are important. Don't hear me say that they're not. They are important. They're just not the most important part of your theology. They do affect your theology, and we want to have a cohesive Christian worldview that works together and makes sense. But they're not the most important parts, and they're not as important as Jesus' resurrection. So as you continue to prioritize your faith, here's what I want you to do. Build your faith on what matters most. Focus on the main thing. The bottom blocks of your faith should be an event, the resurrection. Because if we can trust Jesus with the resurrection, we can trust the rest of Jesus. And you're like, well, how can we trust the resurrection? There were eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses still hold up in a court of law today. Hundreds of eyewitnesses saw Jesus, not some mass hallucination, real people who interacted with the risen Christ. The life and teachings of Jesus changed the world. People who did not believe Jesus started to believe him. Even his own half-brother James, who did not believe Jesus was the Son of God, and then became a church leader and author of the book of James. The life and teachings of Jesus have radically changed our world and the course of human history. The first followers of Jesus, they saw the crucifixion, they heard about the resurrection, they changed their lives. They understood that the resurrection was a real event. It's the building block that when we make it into our foundation, it changes everything. And so we join a long line of people who place their faith in Jesus because of the resurrection. We are part of a rich history of Jesus followers. So, what is the foundation of your faith? What are you building it on? I want to challenge you with two things as we apply what we've talked about today. First, don't walk away from your faith unnecessarily. Lots of people do. Maybe you've been wrestling with the stuff we've been talking about, these topics, or things you're learning in class or reading online. Maybe there's a Bible story, or maybe even a passed down belief from your family that you're wondering if it holds up. Maybe you've learned something in science class that's really tough to argue with, and you think it's got the potential to topple your faith. If you build your faith on the resurrection, that doesn't have to be the case. You don't have to lose your faith. You don't have to be shaken or afraid when it's questioned. You can even ask questions, and you can wrestle with the evidence, and you can still keep your faith in the process. Secondly, build your faith on what matters most. Your faith in Jesus is based on his resurrection, an event 2,000 years ago, with the evidence of hundreds of witnesses and friends defending what they saw and what actually happened. And we are living in a world that has been completely turned upside down by followers of the way of Jesus. So when you build your faith on what matters most, you will build a faith that lasts. Science can't explain the person of Jesus, can't explain the life he lived, can't explain the resurrection he pulled off. But when it comes down to it, that's what matters most. So we're going to shift gears here because over the past few weeks in small groups, you guys have been talking, you guys have been asking questions. And so tonight I wanted to shorten the message time and then use the rest of our message time to actually answer or talk about some of the questions you guys have been asking. Does that sound like a good way to spend some more time? Yeah. I think you guys have been asking great questions. So I love this kind of stuff. I want to take I love questions. I take them seriously. I think that as Christians we have reasonable answers. So I want to be able to share some of those with you tonight, or at least what our best guesses are. First question, Jaden. How old is the Earth really? I know some of you guys were talking about carbon dating and radiometric stuff and all that. Here's what we need to know about determining the age of the Earth. Every method of determining the Earth's age relies on assumptions which may or may not be accurate. And it doesn't matter if you're coming at it from a Bible perspective or a science perspective. So for example, from a Bible perspective, you might hear the term young Earth creationist. Someone who would say maybe the estimated age of the Earth is around 6,000 years. You might hear old Earth creationists, something greater than 6,000 years, maybe 10, 15, 20,000. How do they get those numbers? Well, it depends on, one, how they translate days, specifically in Genesis 1 on the first day of creation, second day of creation, because there's another part of the Bible where it says that to the Lord a day is like 1,000 years. And so people wonder, well, is that the same kind of day we're talking about here? Well, as we look in those other parts of Scripture, we're talking about poetry and metaphor and symbolic language. The word used for day in the Hebrew Old Testament is the word Yom, Y-O-M. So when you look on your calendars and you see things like Yom Kippur, those are Jewish holidays, day of. I had the numbers written on a notepad in my office and I left them there. But it is over 1,000 times in Scripture that the word day translated means a literal 24-hour day. It is far less that the day is taken to mean something as another unit of time. So sometimes you'll see in prophetic books, they'll talk about the coming day of the Lord. It's talking about a coming time when there's going to be judgment or God's going to do something. But it's pretty apparent what that kind of day is talking about. Not a literal day, but an age or a span of time. It also depends on potential gaps in Genesis. So one of those potential gaps is actually in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 1:2 says, now the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. People have wondered or hypothesized, is there actually a gap between verse 1 and 2? We don't know. There could be. So was maybe the earth formless and void, and it just sat there in space, and then later was created? It's a reasonable hypothesis. We simply don't know. They've also wondered about gaps in genealogies. So when we read through Genesis and we see so-and-so lived for 700, 800, 969 years, they're wondering if in those genealogies, maybe they don't actually name every name, father, son, or did they skip any generations and only recorded the important names? So that's how, if you take all those things literally, literal days, no potential gaps, and the genealogies being father, son, you can rewind that and get about 6,000 years. That's where they come to with that. If you say maybe the days are ages, if there's a gap in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and if there's some gaps in the genealogies, you could get over 6,000 years. Simply put, we don't know. We tend, at least here at Crossroads, we'll tend to take what we'll call a literal reading of Scripture, which means, we take it literally. But the parts that make sense literally. We don't take poetry literally. We don't take symbolic language literally. We understand it needs to be translated differently. Is it millions or billions of years? Again, depending on theoretical assumptions, we have really limited resources like carbon dating. I know you guys were talking about that. Carbon dating works really well for things that are more recent in history. The farther back you get, carbon-14 is the element, actually breaks down and is a lot less reliable, which can end up, because we're working with assumptions here, can end up actually being circular reasoning. People ask the question, well, how do we know how old those rocks are, that rock formation? Because we found Cretaceous fossils in there. Well, how do we know they're Cretaceous fossils? Because they're found in that rock formation. Becomes a little bit more circular reasoning. But they would, estimate 4 to 5 billion years. So that's my quick stab at that one, making sense of how do we come up with some of these things. Next question. Where did other skin colors come from if God only made 2 people? That's a great question. So a couple theories that we could speculate, because guess what? The Bible doesn't tell us where skin colors came from. So some theologians have the idea that maybe God created racial diversity at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. If you know that story, man was creating a tower to the heavens. They wanted to rival God, and God decided to confuse their languages so they couldn't work together anymore. And so those people groups who would have spoke same languages would have splintered off, traveled. We would have seen inbreeding, smaller gene pools of communities, which maybe would have led to people with similar features. We can also factor in environmental things like, warmer climates, sunny climates, things tend to have darker skin. Northern climates, colder climates tend to have lighter skin. The other theory is Adam and Eve actually maybe possessed all the genes to produce a full spectrum of descendants. That would make sense too. And then as people splintered and then spread out, the inbreeding in the gene pools would have been smaller. Features would have been localized to different geographical regions and that kind of thing. I think you can synthesize both of these theories in some ways, but we could say, that's where skin colors come from. Next question. There are so many translations of the Bible, how do we know what's accurate? This was a great question. First thing you need to know about Bible translations is translations happen with teams of scholars. This isn't someone sitting down with what they believe to be an ancient text and writing what they want. This is why I actually advocate for paper Bibles. I know a lot of people use their devices, and that's good too. But in the beginning of my Bible, in the first few pages, we always skip over those because, there's no book of the Bible there. But in the first few pages, mine has an introduction to the Bible, specifically this translation, the NLT, which I use on Sunday nights. And it talks about the translation team. It has a list of all the translators and what they translated. It talks about what was their reasoning behind translating certain things. So it helps you understand there's a team of people working together, coming to agreement, which is really helpful. There's 2 main types of Bible translations. One we would call word-for-word translations, and they take the Hebrew and Greek words and find the closest English words to the Hebrew and Greek. So ESV, NASB, even King James, they're looking at Hebrew and Greek and going word for word, let's translate. That's why sometimes when you read those, they can be a little bit harder to understand or a little bit clunky in English. There's also thought translations. They take Hebrew and Greek thoughts, ideas, concepts, expressions, and expresses that in English. Why that's helpful is because any of you who have ever studied another language, whether it's Chinese, Spanish, or Hebrew and Greek, know that there are certain things in languages that just don't translate well to English. And so you want to translate the concept. What were they meaning there? That's actually one of the reasons why I use NLT here for youth group, because I know we all come from different backgrounds with our exposure to the Bible. And I want to try to find something that maybe helps us not be as clunky so that we can get to the meanings behind things. Both are helpful and necessary and can be used as a primary translation. They have amazing teams of scholars behind them. Paraphrases, like the Message, can be helpful for new perspectives, but they shouldn't be used as your primary study text. They're just paraphrases. Next slide. Oh, I didn't update. I had a whole other slide about translations and what happens if one went wrong. And short answer is this: when it comes to translations of the Bible, we actually have thousands and thousands of copies of manuscripts. Compared to other ancient works, Julius Caesar, Herodotus, Greek historian, things like that, who we only have much smaller copies, sometimes 8. Hey, it is there! Awesome! Did I just put it in the wrong spot?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks. 643 copies of the works of Homer. Only 643 copies of Homer gives us 95% confidence in his texts. Some of these copies written 1,400 years after the people wrote them. When we compare it to even our New Testament, we have 5,000 plus manuscripts or copies. It gets tricky. I'm going to save you the details there. Originals and copies of the originals. Many of these copies written between 200 and 300 years after the events happened, and even many more of the original writings were within 100 years of the events happening. Right? The Apostle Paul to write, Luke to write, like these guys were writing 30, 40, 50, 60 years after the event, so much closer, and many more manuscripts. Gives us at least 99% confidence of the original text. Next. So what happens if someone copies something wrong? I made this graphic a while back, I still refer to it. At the top we have the original Greek manuscripts of New Testament books. They were written from someone like Paul, sent to a place like Ephesus, copied and spread around, and then spread around to the other churches in the area. From there, those copies were made more copies and more copies. So what happens if one copy goes wrong? That's the red circle there. And then the ones that follow continue to be misprinted. Well, we still have thousands of others that are accurate, and we can compare them across the board to see, whoa, the majority of the texts say this. And guess what? Bible translators don't try to hide that there are variances. If you look in your Bible notes, it will tell you, hey, some translations say this. A lot of times, it doesn't even change the meaning. Really helpful. So you can have a lot of confidence that we have the right Bible. Next question. Was there an ice age? When did it happen? Does the Bible say anything about it? The Bible never mentions an ice age, but that doesn't mean that an ice age or ice ages never happened. One idea is that perhaps it simply didn't affect the people of the Middle East. Maybe ice ages weren't as widespread as we thought. Maybe they affected northern climates more, or at least temperate zones, and maybe not as much the desert or Middle East. Scientific evidence does suggest patterns of cooling and warming, which could bring about an ice age. But none of the scientific theories prove or disprove the Bible. From there, there's a lot of speculation. We simply don't know when these things happened. And as Bible believers, we try to figure out, when could it fit? Well, could it have happened during the time of Noah and the flood and lots of environmental changes? Sure, it's possible. But we simply don't know. And not knowing doesn't threaten our faith. It's okay. Next one. Were there any dinosaurs on Noah's Ark? Why don't we see them today? If we are to answer yes, we are assuming both a young earth and a global flood. So again, as we talk through things, we do assume certain things. So if we assume a young earth, we're assuming young earth because humanity, not just men, humanity and dinosaurs would have coexisted. Could that have been possible in a world before sin entered? We'd have no fear of them. It's possible. So yes, if there were dinosaurs on the ark, that could totally happen if we assume young earth and global flood. But they probably wouldn't be called dinosaurs. The term didn't exist until around 1840. Let's see, what else did I want to say here? Also, they could fit, most dinosaur species were horse size or smaller, many even more, chicken size or smaller. So we could have seen different types or different species of dinosaurs. Maybe as that's definitely a explanation. We could say if God created in 6 literal days, then humans and dinosaurs coexisted. Yep, evidence includes Job 40 and 41. Job 40 and 41 mention things like Behemoth and Leviathan, talking about being these great giant beasts that we don't necessarily have proper English idea of what they are. We also see cave drawings and other ancient depictions. So I think for cave drawings and stuff, like people would have seen these things, and that's why we see the writing. So there's evidence for the dinosaurs and people coexisting. The other thing I would point out is that modern taxonomy didn't exist for Noah. That's a modern scientific classification. Could there be a difference between God saying, go and get 2 of every kind, versus what we call species today, and the hyper-specific lineages of different animals and things? So there's a lot of ways to think about this that can make sense and can line up with what we see in Scripture. Do I have one more question? What's the deal with all the different ideas about beginning of the universe and creation? Last week I said I was going to do a video. I did do the video, but then there were audio problems, so I couldn't upload the video. I'm going to try to fix that for you guys. Look, the Bible, if we're going, again, we're assuming the Bible's true, it's reliable. The Bible then provides a plausible explanation of the origin of the universe. And that explanation was widely held for a long time. So it's really the alternative ideas would come from people who don't necessarily believe God. So they need another explanation because the Bible only gives one. So an atheist or agnostic would need a different plausible explanation for the origins of things because they reject God or a deity. What I think is interesting is that they latch on to Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, if you know anything about Darwin, his work doesn't explicitly confirm or deny the existence of a deity. Darwin was actually a theist. He didn't necessarily believe the God of the Bible, but he believed a God as like a first cause type of thing. Because his theory of evolution leaves a lot of wiggle room, atheists and agnostics have grappled onto that to say, hey, here's a plausible theory for us of how we can get creation without a God. That's what it boils down to. So I realize I just crushed through those really fast. Did I have one more question, Jaden? Oh, recommended resources. I love resources because they help me learn. First one, Can Science Explain Everything by John C. Lennox. Short book, only 120 pages. Great notes. I read this one, loved it. It's simple. I think if you're a high schooler, like, you have no problem like digging into this and making sense of it. Other book I would recommend, 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask and Answer About Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin. Each of her chapters focuses on a different topic, but she does have one on science, as well as many other topics, and I think you would love that. 2 online resources. I love the website gotquestions.com. If I say do research online, I realize that there's a lot of resources online that are not trustworthy. Got Questions is a trustworthy resource. As I've done my study, I find a lot of what they say there lines up with what I believe to be true about what Scripture says and the theology that I have studied. So you can literally go there, and then they have like an ask a question. Type your question in like you would Google, and they're going to give you articles that relate to that topic. Super helpful. Sometimes videos too. Other one that I love Sean McDowell. SeanMcDowell.org. He does a lot of great videos where he asks the hard questions. Just recently, he sat down to do a Q&A with an atheist. And what I love about him is he does it in a respectful and honoring way to the other person, even if they don't agree. And yet they can come to conclusions, talk about why they believe what they believe, and I think he offers a lot of help in just the dialogues we find ourselves in today. So that's what I got for you guys tonight. Was that helpful?
Yes.
Good. Well, hey, before we go to small groups, and we're wrapping up this series, tonight we talked about what do we build our faith on. And so I'm going to invite the worship team back up. I'm going to pray, and we're going to sing just one more song about what we build our lives on. So would you pray with me? God, we're thankful for tonight. Thank you that we can dig into your word, that we can find hope, that we can find answers. God, thank you for the brains that you gave us, that we can think critically about the world we live in, come up with ideas and theories that are reasonable and make sense. God, as we go back to the question we started with tonight, what are we building our faith on? Father, I pray that it's you. Would you stir in our heart? Would you move us? Would you convict us? If we're building it on something else, would you rip that away? You point us back to Jesus, the resurrection, the hope of eternal life, forgiveness of sins.